Ladies and gents, welcome to the Shroom Live podcast. This evening, we're going to be talking about Kingfish, shore casting, shore jigging with High Life, High Nguyen. And he's specialized in this technique, fishing around the metropolitan Sydney areas, Sydney Harbour, Botany Bay, chasing, of course, kingfish, but your other pelagics as well. You can throw that into the mix, the salmon, the tailor, the tuna, maybe even Jewies at times. So it's going to be a really exciting talk with him today. He's going to be sharing a lot of his expertise and his tips. So without further ado, let's welcome him to the Shroom Live. Welcome. Hi, how are you going, mate?
I'm going good, thanks, Shrim. Good to be on the podcast. Good to talk about shore jigging and shore casting as well. Yeah, excited.
That's great. It's something that I want to delve into in a lot of detail in this podcast here because I know a lot of the people at home, some people may have tried shore jigging. Shore casting, a bit of a different sort of thing. I think it's a term that hasn't quite caught on yet, so I'm interested to explore a little more on that. But let's just talk a little bit about, who you are as a person and your fishing journey as such. Let's just get a brief introduction so that the guests, or so that the audience can understand, who you are as a guest tonight.
Yeah, so I've been fishing for majority of my life. Since I was a kid, going every weekend out to the beach, Botany Bay, Sydney Harbour, and we would catch anything from catfish in between the breakwall rocks to live baiting for kingfish, for jewfish off the beach. So I've fished most of my life, and I've always had an interest in the sea and the ocean. Um, and just recently, I think. So I've been primarily bait fisherman for most of my life, up until about 7 years ago when I discovered lure fishing. Um, I was actually fishing along one of the wharves, and I noticed a couple of old Japanese men throwing out lures and jigging them all the way back to shore. And I thought it was quite strange at first. And I was there live baiting for kingfish, and they actually happened to outfish me. They actually caught way more kingfish than I did. And I caught absolutely no kingfish on the live bait, on the expensive live bait, expensive gear they've got, live baiting. So you can imagine I walk over to these Japanese men and I ask them, like, how are you guys doing this? Like, what are you using? And so they told me it's a technique called shore jigging, where you throw out these metal lures, and you jig them back
Right.
to shore. And apparently kingfish love this. So ever since then, I did a lot of research, asked them a bit more about it, learned from a lot of different people, as well as going to the tackle store, asking people about the technique as well. And from that point on, I've been hooked, as you can say.
Right. So you basically did what a lot of people do, and that's go up to some randoms and say, "You caught anything, mate?" And then have a look in the bucket, and then you saw all these big kingfish, and you're like, "Oh, geez, how did these guys get them?"
That's it. That's it, mate. Yeah, just like asking random people.
um, like the story there that you presented is so common across most anglers that have become complete addicts these days. And you pretty much just start off with your bait fishing. You love being outdoors. You love hitting the water, and you sort of fish in the area that you were introduced to for quite a while, and then you slowly just sort of you see something, you read about something, you hear something, and then before you know it, you're heavily stuck into this new sort of niche in terms of fishing, and it's just captured your imagination. And I guess like being Japanese anglers, I feel like they're just so far ahead of the game in some ways, like the gear that comes out of that place.
Oh yeah,
I mean, I
absolutely.
know for sure I love my Japanese. Yeah, exactly. I love my Japanese rods, reels, lures, and
Yeah,
apparel.
I
It's
see
just
you
like
standing there spinning with your exists and your $1,000 rod. So I know what you mean. They're not cheap stuff, but they're definitely very high quality stuff. And I myself have a lot of the expensive Japanese gear as well, because they last forever and they catch fish. So
now further about this sort of answer here. Did you go back? pretty much the next weekend or the next month with your jigs, which are obviously now very similar to the ones that you saw, and you started to try that sort of approach.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So after I've seen these Japanese guys, I did a lot of research on it. Came across a very famous Japanese shore jigger who actually pioneered a sub variation of shore jigging called um, shore slow, where he uses slow jigs instead of the fast moving responsive jigs that move up and down the wall column really quickly. He uses slow jigs where it'll move up quickly on the recoil of the rod tip, but it will sink very slowly down. Um, Creating more of a flutter action that's more enticing to not only kingfish but other demersal species like your snapper, your flathead, and your flounder, and all the other species as well. So from that technique, he was able to create a sub variation of shore jigging, where shore jigging was originally primarily to catch pelagic fish, primarily fish that live in the middle of the wall column and roam the ocean in the middle of the wall column. They're not bottom feeders like your demersal species, like your flathead, your flounder, your snapper. Um, but with this subvariation of shore slow, you're able to catch those species as well as your normal pelagic fish. Yeah, and his name is Numata, Palms Numata, or Numata Junichi. I think his first name is called Junichi Numata.
Right.
Um, yeah, and he's a very, very good and experienced angler. Um, if you catch him on YouTube, you can probably search it up on Palm's Global YouTube channel. You'll see him
Right.
catch massive kingfish from the shore, whereas using his own, he actually creates his own lures and he sells them in Australia and worldwide, of course. And a lot of people have caught a lot of kingfish, a lot of fish using his lures. They have stick baits all the way down to your normal fast moving responsive jigs to all the way to your slow moving slow jigs as well. Yeah. And so
Right.
from
So slow shore.
yeah.
Yeah, carry on.
Yes, yeah. So from his technique, I was able, and his videos and all the articles he's had, and some of them were in Japanese, so it wasn't easy doing a lot of this research. I had to like
Yeah.
translate a lot of the Japanese text into English and like trying to comprehend what they're trying to say. Um, and through learning and doing my research and talking to local tackle stores like ISO Fishing Lifestyle, the guys there, Gab and Will, they were able to help me out with getting a first setup ready. And my first setup was actually, going back to your question, was actually a medium light setup with like a Daiwa over there rod paired with a
Right.
Certate LT 3000 reel, and with running PE 0.8 at the time, so it was about 10 pounds of line. I was able to catch my first kingfish, not off the wharfs, but actually catch my first kingfish off the rocks with that setup.
Yeah, that's pretty insane because you just mentioned that you're using 10 pound off the rocks.
Yeah.
That takes some skill.
And some ignorance on my end as well, because I thought 10 pounds was enough for the rocks, but I I can assure you I got briefed many times and I've lost a lot of jigs at the start of my journey because of that. I didn't realize until later on you have to use like at minimum 30 pounds off the rocks, because you're gonna get dusted and smoked by kingfish. Um, but on the beach, that's a
Right.
different story because there's less structure.
Yeah, now I was going to ask you halfway through about shore slow itself. So, would you say that that's similar to shore jigging? I mean, you said that there is a difference, but in your approach as you fish Sydney, do you basically change the way that you fish, or it's more of a fact where, look, these jigs do this sort of action and you can get the best out of them working them just a little bit differently, but more or less it's the same sort of, terrain and approach?
Yeah,
Would you say that, or would you say that it is actually very different?
it's different and it's also the same. It's the same action and movement and variations of the technique of jigging the rod tip, and using that recoil of the rod tip to flick the jig back up and then letting the jig sink back down in its own natural flutter. But it's also different in the respect that the jig itself moves very different compared to, so a slow jig moves very different compared to a fast moving responsive jig. A fast moving responsive jig would float like that, or swirl all the way
Yep.
down. A slow jig will flutter slowly on the way down. So you would imagine you can use the same fast moving technique of jigging up and down as you would with a fast moving jig with a slow jig. But
Yep.
with a slow jig, you can also move it very slowly and let that flutter really work itself, and really get that bait, that fish to be enticed by the lure. So it's different, but it's also the same. Like the movement of jigging it is the same, but the movement of the jig is very different. So a lot of people get confused between the two, when to use it. I would say
Yep.
use a slow jig is very good for when the fish aren't on the hot bite. But a fast moving responsive jig is good when the fish are on the bite, because it's moving very fast, and kingfish love a good chase. But when the kingfish aren't in the move, they might be feeling a little bit lethargic, or they're a bit full already, and they're not really
Yep.
enticed by a chase. That's when you use a slow jig, because it stays in their face for a lot longer, and it gives them the opportunity to decide, all right, look, this is an easy meal. I'll just smash it, you know. And that's basic the premise
That's right.
of a slow jig. It's to make the meal even easier than it was before compared to a fast moving responsive jig.
Yeah, it's sort of like the concept of being in the strike zone. You stay in the strike zone longer as the jig is falling, and at a slower pace, that duration is greatly increased as opposed to a fast sinking jig. Now, I just want to go back to the differences between the two styles of jigs. In my opinion, the fast jigs are shaped in a way that they sort of sink a little bit like a rock. They're trying to get depth pretty quickly, and they try to slice through the water quickly as well on the jerk up. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the jerking up action in a second, but these slower jigs, they're definitely like a lot more wider. They they grip. That's not the right word, but they're not hydrodynamic on the way that you lift them up or you let them flutter down. There's a lot of resistance against the water.
So I definitely agree with that. I've actually got a few jigs here, for example, um, for people to see as well.
That's a
So
good idea. We can have a look at some of these jigs.
so this here is, I don't know if you can see that properly. This here is a palms the smelt lure, and it is, as you can see from the
Palms
shape,
smelt. Yep.
it's a very long elongated shape. It's convex. It's not convex on one side. It's very uniform. You can see, and when it moves in the water, you'll see it jig up, and then it falls back down very quickly, and it will be up and down, up and down, up and down very quickly, and that's a fast moving responsive jig. Whereas I'll bring up the slow jig, if I can grab it without hooking myself. um, the slow jig on the I don't know, left or right side, what your viewers are seeing, but the gold one, you can see it's convex. So one side is flatter than the other side, and it's not uniform at all. Um, and it's actually, so when it falls, instead of up and down, that's what a fast moving jig does. A slow jig goes up, and then it goes flutters down slowly. And it might not be this shape, because
Yeah.
a lot of different slow jigs have different shapes and they flutter differently on the way down, but it is a very slow strip down. And you can see also the slow jig is a lot wider than the fast responsive jig, and that aids in the water resistance and for the jig to flutter a bit more than the fast moving responsive jig.
Yeah. Also, with the slow jig there, they do that little. It's like a side to side wobble of the blade. I don't know how to describe that part of the lure itself, but not only does it do that action that you said, it sort of flutters along its axis
Yeah.
down, and obviously that can be very slow. And if you just do you thumb the line at all, like slow down the line and sort of make it fall vertical? You can get through and
Yeah.
penetrate through to the depths a bit quicker that way.
Yeah. So sometimes I like to, if you cast out, um, so I've got my rod here as well. So if you cast out and you open up the bail and you cast out and you close the bail straight away, what would happen is the jig will it won't fall vertically down. It will start actually falling towards you. So say if the jig's landed in the water here, it won't fall vertically down like that. It will fall diagonally down towards you. If you close the bail and you
Right.
line in the slack line, it will do that. But if you cast it out and you don't close the bail arm straight away and you just have a little bit of tension on the line just so that you're controlling how much line's coming out, but not letting a bird's nest come out of your spool straight away once it's hit the water. You're controlling the actual flutter of the jig down. So instead of fluttering towards you, it's now free spooling, fluttering vertically down and hitting exactly that water column that you want it to land on, rather than landing towards you. And you can do that, and that would actually sometimes when I do that, I'm able to cover more ground than I would when I close the bail arm straight away. When I close the
Right.
bail arm straight away, that's when I'm expecting a hit on the drop, because when it's closed, the tension of the line is a lot higher, and you'll feel a hit come, and you can actually
Yep.
strike on the fish. But if you free spool, you won't feel that, and you won't be able to strike. You will feel when the fish strikes it, but you won't be able to strike on the hit and hook up if it's free spooling. So it's up to you what you want to do. When it's the conditions are the fish aren't on the bite, and you've had a couple casts already, and you haven't had a bite on the drop yet. I would then start free spooling when I cast out, just so that I can cover as much ground as possible when I jig the jig back up, and I'm not losing. So when it flutters on the diagonal line, you can see that all this area here you're not covering. But if it flutters on the vertical down, then you've got this area to work along here. So you can jig it back up, let it float back down, jig it back up, let it float back down. Yeah. So if you're expecting the bite on the actual jig up, I would have the bail arm close. But if you're expecting the bite,
Yep.
when you're expecting the bite on the way up, I would have the bail arm open so that it flutters vertically down, and that will allow you to cover
Yep.
more volume of the water column. But if you're
Yep.
expecting the bite on the way down as it's fluttering, I would close the bail arm so that you can feel and you can strike when the fish actually hits the lure on the way down. So that's my one of my tips I
Yeah.
would give people.
No, that's a good point there. I was going to say that if you're fishing off the rocks, I guess it's a little different fishing inside the river for brim, where you might have the fish at your feet. You might have the fish at your feet when you're fishing off the rocks, but you can't get them out of the caves and the structure at your feet. You really want to get the biggest cast you can and work it and hook it out away from the structure. So you want distance in that case.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the benefits of using a jig over a soft plastic or whatever. Yeah, it's just the aerodynamic of it. It's just solid metal. It's gonna penetrate through the
Yep.
air much easier, and so it's going to be more aerodynamic, and it's going to go further. So you're able to cover a lot of casting ground, and you're going to be able to cast up. I usually cast about 100 meters easily with a jig versus any other lure. Um, yeah, I'd
That's
be
a monster
lucky.
cast. I mean,
Yeah,
what is it? Two swimming pools worth? Two Olympic swimming pools, is it?
yeah,
Worth a
yeah.
distance. That's crazy.
Especially if you're using a medium light setup, because the line's so
10 pound.
thin.
If you're using 10 pound, 100 meters for sure.
ten
10 pound for
pound,
sure.
yeah. If you're using P1.5, I've cast 100 meters. I'm confident that I can cast about 100 meters with P1.5 versus like P4. P4, I'd maybe get like maybe like get by 700 meters on P4. But yeah, the thinner the
Yeah.
line as well. That's why I like to use Japanese line. I know that some people argue that Japanese line isn't as strong as like the American lines or the Australian made lines. There's some truth to that. But the benefit of Japanese line is that the diameter is so thin, it can penetrate through the air really easily. Um, and a lot of them have a coating
Yep.
on them to make it very smooth and subtle. So cast through, so they move through the guides really easily, and you're able to cast very far with the Japanese thinner lines. Um, than your normal like line, like a Berkeley line, for example. I've used Berkeley before, and they're good line for bait fishing, but for the purpose of shore jigging, not so great. And the main reason because the diameter is so thick, you're not able to cast that far. Um, but if you're bait fishing,
Right.
you don't need to cast that far. You just need to cast where the fish are, you know, and you let the scent of the bait lure the fish in. You don't have that
Yeah.
that benefit using a metal jig because what's fish can't really smell metal, can they? Or I can't imagine a fish
No, I
liking
mean the
a bit of metal down their throat.
the smell of lead,
Yeah,
painted lead,
exactly.
aluminium. I mean, you can get other materials, I guess, as well, like tungsten and all that, but none of these are soluble, so you can't taste the molecules of your metal per se,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I mean, if they made a metal out of like pilchards or something, and it had the pilchard scent, damn, that would kill. That's $1 million idea there.
Yeah, that's a good one there. Maybe rub that metal jig on a pilchard, or store them with a bag of pillies on the way to the fishing spot.
Yeah.
Get that scent. I mean, it can't penetrate the meat, but it might give you a little bit more confidence, and that first cast might have a little bit of that smell still.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, about the concept of the tip recoil, you mentioned about the tip recoil. Now, I know a lot of these shore jigging and shore casting. I mean, we haven't really talked about shore casting yet. We've talked about shore jigging and shore slow, I think it was. That requires, I mean, not that it requires this, but because it's a Japanese technique, the Japanese market makes rods for this specific purpose, and a lot of them have that. I mean, I'm sure we're going to be talking about gear a little bit later, just in and about this discussion here, but you're looking at like 8 foot to 12 foot rods, somewhere in between, which you'll get into later, but they've got that really springy sort of long tip section, which you call the recoil of the tip. Could you explain a little bit about that?
So a typical shore jigging rod is about 10 foot long. Um, it will be very strong in the butt section, and I'll show you the butt section. So it'll be very strong in the butt section here. So that's not moving, really, not moving at all. And that's to turn the fish in case it gets too close to the rocks, to the ledge underneath you where there's a lot of structure, it can bust you off. And also it helps in aiding
Yep.
lifting the fish up and onto the and landing the fish. In the midsection, I've got a midsection here. There's a little bit more give. There's a little bit more flexibility. Like I can feel it, bending a little bit. But that's still very strong, and that's again to aid in fighting the fish, preventing it from reefing you, and also lifting the fish up. But in the tip section, and I've got the tip section here as well. So luckily, I've got a 3 foot, 3 piece rod, so I can show you each of the pieces individually.
Yeah. So these are basically usually 3-piece rods because of the
No, no.
way
So
I mean, the way you've explained
yeah.
it.
So usually they're two-piece rods. I just happen to own a 3 piece because I like the easeability of traveling with it, especially climbing down to get
Right.
to hard to get rock ledges that I normally fish at as well. It's just lighter, easier, more compact. So it's not poking me anywhere when I've got it on my back. But the purpose of explaining it to your viewers, I just happen to have a 3 piece rod that I use for traveling and stuff to show. But normally a shore jigging rod is a 2 piece rod. But
Yeah.
yeah, but so the 3 piece, the third part of the rod is the tip, and you can see the tip is very flexible, like very flexible, and that's to help in recalling
Yeah,
the
I can
jig up.
see that it's still quite strong, but it's got that bend that's
Yeah,
different to the other sections.
yeah, and the bend will help flick the. So I don't know if you can see that on camera, but it will help flick the jig back up. And the more recoil it has, the quicker the jig is going to
Yep.
responsibly get flicked back up. And also it aids in a little bit of flicking the jig out as well with the casting distance. And so a sensitive,
Yep.
flexible tip like this is important for a shore jigging rod, just so that you can properly maneuver the jig up and down the water column without too much effort. And most of that effort is due to the natural recoil of the rod tip flicking that jig back up.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting because a lot of the shorter rods, not made for shore jigging, of course, but just lure rods in general, if you fish them, you can get your lifts and hops quickly, and you don't have to rely on the tip to basically put that final action into the lure. But because these rods are so long, I'm starting to see that you sort of lift a rod and the flicking of the lure is a bit delayed until that transmission of bend goes to the tip, and
Yeah,
then the tip finishes it, and
yeah,
you get that nice consistent action.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
So
And you can imagine,
yeah, that
so
must be.
yeah, so you can imagine when you're holding the rod
Yeah,
and
carry on.
you're jigging it like this, you're gonna
Yep.
a lot of the action is not from you jigging it. A lot of the action is just the tip of the rod flicking it, and all you're doing is that motion up and down, and the more sensitive the rod tip is and more responsive the rod tip is, it's going to aid in you using less effort to flick that jig back up, because there's a lot of water resistance between a metal and the ocean. So you can imagine, it's a
Yep.
lot of work flicking it back up. But if you have a sensitive rod tip, you just one flick, rod tip flicks it back up. That's it, and then you let it flood it back down.
Let's actually put that back under your arm. So you're a left hand wind, right hand sort of action imparter.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's
So
just go through a little bit about just quick techniques since we're here with the combos.
yeah. So the technique I like to use is I like to have it under my armpit, and I like to have the rod tip very high up like that, maybe about 45-degree angle, or maybe sometimes a little bit higher if
Yep.
there's a lot of structure. And I'm just keeping it high, like about 45 degrees, and flicking it all the way to about maybe 20 degrees up in the air vertically. And I'm flicking as well, I'm turning the what's it called? The retrieving
The
the
handle.
handle. Yeah, the retrieving handle. So as I'm turning, one flick equals one turn, and that's the standard jigging method. One tip flick, and then you can also do half turn. So instead of turning the whole way, like you would, with a fast responsive jig, you can also slow
Yep.
the action down by doing a half turn, flick, half turn, flick, half turn, flick, and yeah, and so
Yep.
it's like a half turn, and it's not a full turn. And then you can also break it down even slower. So for a slow jig, I would recommend doing this. There's a quarter turn, so you can go move a little jig, move a little jig, and it's a quarter turn jerk. I think they call it quarter turn jerk, half jerk, full jerk. But what
Right.
that would happen is that when you quarter turn, what would happen is the jig basically, if you do a quarter turn, there's a lot more slack in the line. So when you pull up, there's less force pulling the jig up. So the jig would, so you can imagine the jig, if you do a full turn, the jig is going to go all the way up and flutter all the way down.
Right.
If you do a quarter turn, the jig is just going to go up and then down, up and then down, up and then down, up and then down, like that. So it's not going to go all the way up
I like
through the
that.
water column. It's going to just do a little motion, similar to how you use soft plastics, Shroom. Not that different, to be
That's
honest.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, when you do those little micro, I see you doing the little micro flicks of the wrist. That's a quarter turn jigging action.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It makes sense. You're using slower jigs. You don't want to be basically pulling at the speed of sound through the water.
Yeah.
The slow jigs, you want to move it slow. It's going to flutter down slowly. You could impart a little bit more energy into the jig, make it a bit faster, but you don't want to blow it out of the water, so to speak,
Yeah.
down in the depths there, because that's the reason why you're using a slow jig technique. But if you're using one of them faster jigs, all for it. You've got your half and you've got your full turn,
Yeah. Exactly.
and you can put that up and down through the energy column, through the water column, and you might just trigger a bite.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And those are the main movements I do. Sometimes I do like um, a full lift, and then I'll wind in
Yep.
all the slack, and then all the way, and then I'll lower the rod tip actually down towards maybe a horizontal level, and then I'll again up. I'll just do one jerk up. I won't even turn the handle. I do one turn up, one jig up,
Yep.
one jerk up, and then I move as I'm moving the rod tip back down. I'm taking all the slack line that's left over, and that's called a slow jerk, and that creates a even different action as well. So when you're shore jigging, you want to do as many different techniques, different actions as you can, and you want to, and that's gonna with different rhythms as well. Sometimes you might be doing that rhythm, and then other times you might be doing a slower rhythm, and sometimes you might be just doing that full on jerk and then winding all the slack down. And the jig is going to move very different depending on what action you're applying. And so that slow one, the
Yep.
slow full on jerk, and then taking the retrieve, what's going to happen is it's going to jerk all the way up, and then it's going to flutter all the way down, and it's going to flutter all the way down until it almost hits the bottom, and then I'm going to do the full jerk again, and it's going to go all the way back up, and same thing. And it's instead of going up, 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 flutter, 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 it's going to go up, flutter, 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 all the way down.
Nice.
Yeah.
What would you say is the standard technique that you employ, like your bread and butter? Like if you just went to a spot, you're just gonna have a quick cast.
Yeah.
You have a fast jig on. You've got your full, your half, and your quarter, and obviously that lifting one as well.
My standard would be the half turn every time I jig when I get there. The half turn I feel is like good baseline to see where the fish are at, and if I get a bite on the half, or a hit or a follow on the half, and I see that the fish are actively
Yep.
engaged and they're excited for the chase, then I start speeding it up a bit more. But if I get
Right.
no hits at all, nothing at all, then I slow it down and I do those quarter turns or that one singular jerk and then it sink all the way down.
Yeah, I find maybe the half turn is also the most therapeutic, if you could really call it that. It's like that one technique where you just naturally gravitate towards. It's just good to just mindlessly go up, go down, go up, go down.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very therapeutic. A long day after work, you want to cast it out and you just don't want to think sometimes and you just work it.
That's right. Keeps your hand busy. That's what I always say when you're fishing lures. You got a technique that keeps it busy. You're not pausing too much. It can be frustrating having the slowest technique fishing plastics. Keep it moving. It's nice and it's therapeutic. You're actually actively doing something to the lure, and if you get a hit, you feel like you've made all the difference.
Yeah. And I always say there's nothing like casting a metal jig out far and using pretty much your whole body to cast the jig out, and watching it fly 100 meters and land in the water 100 meters from you. I mean, you can't really do that with any other setup. I can imagine, like maybe like a
No, not at all.
yeah, not at all. I can't. Maybe
Not at
like a
all.
long distance casting rod with one of those like Albi reels. Maybe I don't know, but I just
Yeah.
imagine
One of
a jig
those
flying further.
casting competition like sort of techniques where they bring the rod back forward side and then 360 and then suddenly it launches after like 5 whips.
Yeah,
Something like that. I mean, you get more distance with that, but with a single just launch over your shoulder, I don't think you can beat a metal.
yeah. And most of the shore jigging rods are designed so that you use less effort to actually cast further.
Yeah. Let's quickly just mention some of these lures just really briefly because I want to get into some shore casting.
Yeah.
But what are some example jigs that would work pretty well in this sort of situation with the techniques you've described and the gear?
Oh, for shore casting or shore jigging?
Let's go through all of them, the whole gamut of what we've just talked about, just real briefly.
So when I get to a ledge, or any body of water that's deep enough to hold pelagic fish that we're after with with shore casting, shore jigging, I always start off using a shore casting lure. So the difference in a shore casting, I'll just go through that real quickly, and shore jigging is by the name, you're using a jig um, from the shore, and shore casting is you're
Yep.
casting a lure. So it's not a jig; it's actually a hard body um, from the shore, and you're casting it out far, and you just retrieve it in the specified technique that the lure tells you to do. Some lures require a full on sweep of the rod. So other lures just you basically just wind in. And when other lures
Yep.
you jerk it up once or twice, but hard bodies for shore casting is designed so that you don't have to blow out your shoulder jigging all day. So you can imagine me standing here jigging all day, and I'm working with between 40 to 100-gram lures, sometimes 100-gram jigs, and sometimes 120, 150-gram jigs if the water's really deep. Um, and so you can imagine
Yep.
getting really tired, and sometimes I do get really tired. My shoulder gets really tired from shore jigging. Um, and I know people that I've fished with as well have got rotator cuff injuries from shore jigging, really heavy lures.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, so the Japanese obviously have figured this out, and so they came up with a
Yeah.
technique called shore casting, and you're shore casting hard body lures like this one. So this is Maria loaded uh, floating stick bait. So they're basically
Yes.
they're stick baits. Um, so when I get to a ledge, I normally use to start out in the morning. So I test out the surface with a floating stick bait like this, because you don't know if
Yep.
the fish are keen enough to hit on the surface when you get there. So it's always worthwhile to test out the surface, because that's the easier and that's the more exciting bite that you're going to get. Watching a fish come out of the water and doing a big splush, big splash, and taking a top water lure,
Yep.
I think that's way more exciting than getting hit and then hooking up. Just watching the fish come out of the water, and sometimes they launch out of the water just to get the lure, and you see the whole body in the lure, and you're just in the air, and you're just like, wow.
And also, it's that time of the day where they will hit surface. It's not a big window we're talking about here. Like the jigs, they'll hit it even when the sun's up, but the surface bite for many species, it's not there once that light just comes up and starts peaking. So if you want that bite, you got to do it early. And surface is, like you said, it's got a good payoff, being a technique that you still have all the fun hooking up, but it's that visual aspect that you won't get with a metal jig down deep. So that's, and plus, lure fishing is a sport. So we're trying to get the most out of our sport, and lure fishing is just another avenue to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And lure fishing is about finding the fish yourself, not the fish coming to you, as opposed to bait fishing, because you've got that scent. When you throw out, a pilly, that's creating a lot of scent in the water column to attract fish. Lure fishing, you just all the what's going to lure the fish in is you making a puppet show of your lure, right? So you the angler, you have to find the fish by casting where you think the fish are going to be, and you as the angler have to impart the right technique, the right action on your lure to actually convince and trick the fish to bite. And just going back on
That's true.
the reason why I'm using a top water lure, exactly it. I want to find the fish, and I want to see if the fish are on the surface and biting the surface. So I always start out with a top water lure in the morning at the beginning of my session, and and the lure, when I
Yep.
cast it out, it will sit vertically like this underneath the water. So it will sit like that,
Right.
and and when I retrieve it, what will happen was the head will dip down, and this is a floating stick bait, so it floats like that, and with the bottom, underwater. And when I retrieve the line, it dives underneath the water and it swims in an S shape. It creates a very enticing
Right.
swim. And then when it's done with the swim, it'll come back to the same original position with the head up. And I just repeat that action over and over again, and it creates more of like a injured bait fish unable to swim properly, and it makes it very enticing meal for predators like kingfish to come along and smash it in the morning. And sometimes it also
Yeah, like
looks
a lot
like,
of dying.
yeah, sorry, sure, yeah.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, and sometimes it also looks like a feeding like fish as well, feeding on other fish, and that gets kingfish even more fired up because they're like, wow, there must be so much food in the water right there. I'm just gonna smash that one fish that's feeding on everything, and then I might get extra meals out of it as well. And it convinces the fish
Yeah,
to change its mood from being neutral to excited, keen for the bite.
yeah, that's interesting because poppers do a lot of that, where that little splash and sound is what people believe to be sort of the signs of a fish feeding on some other smaller prey. And who hasn't seen a time when they've hooked up to a fish and they've had its mate following it, following that lure, following that hooked fish? And that's that concept of, I guess, FOMO. They don't want to miss out. If there's a feed going on, they want a piece of that. I think the kingies are really inquisitive. They'll come in and they'll have a look, and
Oh, for sure.
they're just triggered by action.
Yeah, and you'll see kingies try to steal food right out of the mouths of other fish. There's many of times where I've hooked onto a kingfish, and as I'm retrieving him closer to shore, his mate is following right behind, and he's trying to attack the lure too. And so you
Yeah,
can see them chasing other fish down just to steal the fish right out the food right out of the other fish's mouth, and it's absolutely, yeah, amazing to see too.
yeah. It's like a vicious circle of life, as I always say, out there on the ocean. Dog eat dog world out there. All these fish just. It's like a battle royale at times. You got to get your lure in there to be a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely, survival of the fittest.
Now, have we talked about the way to impart that action with the gear? Like, I'm assuming you use a sweeping motion
Yeah.
because
So with
using surface lures with the big lures. Yeah, carry on.
so with the topwater lure, I'm basically sweeping the rod diagonally or diagonally down or along the ledge, like
Yep,
that motion, sweeping motion. And as I'm sweeping, I'm winding in the slack line as well. So, and I'm continually winding
yep.
the handle as I'm moving the action of the rod down over and over again. And they'll make the lure do the action in the water, swim, head back up, swim, head back up, and that's pretty much how you work 90% of stick baits. Is that same
Yeah.
action, the sweeping action, and you can see that it's a lot less tiring than jigging vertically all the time, and that's the main benefit I see to using a stick bait over a jig. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I can see it's definitely using different muscles. You're sort of recruiting a bit more of your hip as well in this case, and lateral sideways turning as opposed to, like you said, people getting rotator cuff injuries and shoulder, discomfort because of that vertical lifting
yeah, you're using
from the
more muscle
jigging
groups.
technique.
Yeah, you're using more muscle groups, so you're tiring. You're not just putting that emphasis just on your shoulder and your arms. You're using your whole body to just sweep it, so it's a lot more easier, less taxing on your body when there's more muscles helping each other out, as opposed to just one muscle, one joint doing all the work.
Yeah, that's good. Let's talk a little bit about something a little different now and talk about sorts of areas that one could hit with this sort of technique. So, in terms of structure, let's talk about the structure that you could find out in the systems in, Sydney Harbour, for example.
Yeah, so I would say different classes of gear that you're using will cover different areas that you're gonna be fishing in. So if you're using something that's medium medium light, so ranging from and we'll talk more about the gear and stuff later. So medium light setup, I'll just say that, and then we'll talk more about that later. But
Yep.
if you're using medium light setup, that's more towards your beach fishing, shore jigging, shore casting, because there's no structure that for you to be afraid of. You can just let the fish run and enjoy the fight, and then eventually the fish will tire out, and you just pull them in onto the beach. Um, but if you're rock fishing and you're fishing where you think there's going to be structure where the fish can bust you off, like maybe it might be along the shoreline of Sydney Harbour, and there might be a whole bunch of oyster
Yep.
beds underneath, or a couple of rocks, a couple of weed underneath, then you're going to be wanting to use the medium setup, and that's going to help you, turn the fish away from the structure and and let the fish tire itself out, and then land the fish and even lift the fish up as well with your medium setup. And with
Yep.
that medium setup, then you go up to your higher end, which is like the heavy setup. And there's also extra heavy setup later on. But in New South Wales, I don't think anyone will need that extra heavy setup, and that's more towards your GT fishing if you're going to Queensland or whatever. But I normally
Yep.
stick between the three classes: your medium light, your medium, and then your heavy setup, which is running, P4 and 5, and that's going to help you catch like a 20 kilo plus kingfish, as for example. And that's going to help you able to not only turn the fish's head when it's diving towards structure, but also potentially lifting the fish up onto the ledge. And the fish would be weighing somewhere around about 20 kilos or more as well. And you're using a
That's the
very
dream.
heavy rod. Yeah, that's the dream, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what every shore jigger, every shore caster is angling for. Catching that meter kingy.
Yep. Now, just going back to those location sort of habitats. So on the beach, you're looking for, the usual stuff. You're looking for gutters, for example.
Yeah,
Using that sort of technique, and or fishing adjacent to areas of beaches
yeah,
leading into rocks. I think that's another pretty good area.
yeah. So if you're taking this technique off to the beach, I actually took this technique to Jarvis Bay a couple months
Right.
ago, and I basically casted at gutters, and I also followed the bait ball around as well. So you sometimes when you're at the beach, you can see seagulls diving at the water, and that's because there's a
Yep.
congregation of bait there, and also potentially a congregation of like pelagic fish around the bait, waiting for one to be an easy meal, to leave the flock, and so they can smash it and eat it and have an easy meal out of it. And so I followed the seagulls around and casted behind where the seagulls diving under. And I was able to catch a numerous amount of tailor. Pretty much every cast was a tailor through that method. And I've
Yep.
also taken it to places like your normal beaches, like like your Manly Beach, your Cronulla Beach, and cast it at gutters and jigging it back for salmon and for
Yeah.
tailor as well, and that works there as well. But you want to look for areas where there's deep water. Is the takeaway from that.
Yeah. I was about to say, So off the rocks, definitely. Deep water would be the number one sort of thing you're looking for. You don't want to be fishing in about a meter of water that
Yeah,
extends out far. You want to be casting into some serious depth and current.
yeah. So you want as much time for your jig to flutter down as possible, and the deeper the better, because that puts your lure in the face of the fish for much longer as well. And that's where you're going to find kingfish. They're hardly ever going to be in shallow water to hunt. They're always hunting in the deeper water, and that's their home. That's their place. That's their domain. They live and breed in the deep water. Um, and so if you can find somewhere that's between I'd say 7 meters, between 7 to 20 meters. That's where I'd be casting my lures all the time. And I'd be using a medium setup between 7 to 20 meters. And if it's
Yep.
20 meters or more, that's when you're going to find a really big fish. And I would be using my
Right.
P4, my heavy setup, to go and target those areas, because if you fish on a medium setup in a drop off that's 20 meters or more, you're most likely going to run across a big kingfish, wanting to bite your lure, and you're going to be smoked if you don't have the right gear.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. Like these sorts of areas, kingfish prefer clean, hard, running water with a lot of depth, with a lot of bait. They're very active fish. They can hang in any sort of current. They're not afraid to just like be swimming all day, really. So
Yeah, they love the current.
yeah,
They love anything that's so if you ever get to a ledge and there's a huge congregation of bait and there's a good current, that's a very good sign for where for kingfish, because the kingfish will lie, just adjacent of the bait, just so that, and they'll stay there for a long time. They'll swim back and forth, just because they want it. They know exactly where the food source is, and whenever they're hungry, they'll just go in and grab the food source and come back and chill again. And that's their main behavior. They're like sheep herders. They hurdle the the herd of sheep, the herd of bait,
yeah,
and then they just go in for an easy a meal every now and then. It's like their refrigerator, their stockpile of food. Um, yeah, they're very smart predators.
would you say that once you sort of see them in the area and there's bait, that's obviously a good sign, like what you said, but they'll come back periodically throughout the next maybe couple of hours or maybe through the rest of the day.
Yeah, for sure. If you if you see a kingfish run past, the chances are there's high chances are they're gonna come back, because they follow the bait ball. If you can bring the bait ball to you, your chances of catching a kingfish skyrockets. So that's why I think, but a
Yep.
lot of people think, oh, I'm just going to show up to this ledge and I'm just going to throw some jigs in and catch kingfish for sure. You out of luck, yeah, definitely. Like, you might get lucky, but if you want to reduce the chance of it just being luck, you're going to need burley. You're going to need to burley up hard, because that's going to bring in the bait ball. That's going to bring in all the bait fish. And when the bait fish are there, the bigger fish are there to eat the bait fish, right? And so I'd
Yep.
suggest using, pillies, or mixing a burley, a bread burl, like some bread together with burley mix and some pillies, and maybe even some tuna oil, and throwing that in the water. And I've even had success watching New Zealanders use kawai, so Aussie salmon. Using that as
Yep.
live bait. Watching them, I had the idea of using kawai as a natural sense of natural burley, by catching one, then tying it to a rope, and then hanging it from the ledge with the rope, and letting the waves naturally crash against the fish and the rocks, and that releases a lot of scent into the water, to attract kingfish. And in New Zealand, they use kawai as live bait for kingfish, and and they chuck out maybe a 50 centimeter kawai, and they'll bring in a 1 meter kingy. And that just goes to show how much kingies love kawai, how much they love Aussie salmon.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's interesting. A lot of people that fish lures don't necessarily use any sort of burley, and it does stand to reason that you sort of got two competing effective ideas. Bait works, but so does lures, but it could sort of conflict between the two of them at certain situations. But in this instance, what you're doing is you're trying to bring the bait ball or keep it at your feet, because if you're on the rocks, you can't do what a lot of people do, which is if you're on the shores of a river, walk along it and cast. You're not that mobile once you're on the rocks. Like, yeah, mate, on a beach you're mobile, but on the rocks you've got other issues such as your safety, and navigating yourself around involves climbing as well and carrying a lot of gear at times. So you're sort of like glued to the one spot, and so when you are, it's a waiting game, and you can improve your chances by getting that bait ball, like you said, like burling it up, and then eventually that's going to get the predators focusing on that ball in front of you, because it's going to be substantial if you maintain a consistent supply of scent and food for the bait fish.
Yeah, absolutely. So you need to burley up. A lot of people just overlook burleying, but it's essential if you're gonna spend your time traveling to these hard to get to rock ledges, you know, and fishing there. You got to invest in some burley because that's gonna pay dividends later in the day. The fish when the fish aren't biting, it's because there's nothing there for them to bite. If you create a scenario where there's heaps of food there for them to come, chances are if you throw out any lure, they're gonna bite, right? and
Yep.
uh, and as you said as well, like you're when you get to a rock ledge, you're locked into that location. You can't really walk along the rock ledge unless it's a big rock ledge, and there's no other people fishing there besides you and your friend fishing with you. You can absolutely do what you do and just walk along the rock ledge and keep casting and trying to find a fish. But if you can't do that and it's a small rock ledge and your safety is involved, and you're battling swell, you're battling wind, and natural conditions and snags, you want to bring the fish to you. So burleying is the best way to do it.
Let's talk about actually doing this technique right now in the month of February, March, and April, and leading into winter. I mean, we're right now at the tail end of summer, so you'd say this is the sort of thing that you could do right now in the season. Head out there to say a beach or a rock ledge, and all the things that we discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, summer is the best time. It's kingfish season. It's pelagic season. The hotter the water temperature gets, the more pelagics come to New South Wales, to Sydney, to our shores, and you can see that already. There's a lot of people catching bonita. I myself have caught heaps of bonita recently as well, and the mac tunas have started arriving as well in Sydney, and I've seen people catch mac tunas in Sydney Harbour as well as Botany Bay, and off the rock platforms
Right.
as well, along the eastern suburbs and the northern suburbs as well. Um, yeah, and so when you want to target kingfish, you want warmer temperatures of the water, and that's gonna help bring in the bait and also the bigger fish.
Would this be something that you also do during the winter, or would you change your approach?
Oh, absolutely! I do this, pretty much every time I go fishing. Or every week, and it doesn't matter if it's winter or summer, because winter you might not get more bites, you might not catching, you might not, well, you probably won't be catching bonito because the water temperature is quite low. It's quite cold. Bonito don't like
Yep.
cold temperatures, but you do get the odd kingfish that in winter don't mind the colder temperatures of the water. As long as there's food there for them to target, they'll come biting. But you won't get a lot of bites in the winter and the colder months. But when you do, it's usually a bigger kingfish that has a lot of a lot of fat as well. I find that when you catch those bigger kingfish during the winter, the colder months, they have a lot of fat stored in them, and probably because to
Right.
survive the colder temperatures and the less food there is available to them during those colder months as well.
Sounds like blubber for whales. They get that protection from the cold, and they can just go down to the what is it, the Antarctica down south. Arctic Circle up north,
Yeah,
that sort of
absolutely.
thing.
Everyone's got their winter fat. Summers for shredding, and winters for bulking, and fish are exactly the same as humans, I guess, in that respect.
Pretty much, pretty much. Now let's talk about conditions. Conditions, you know, morning, afternoon, night, tide, rainfall, barometer, moon phase, all that sort of stuff. How would you say that sort of impacts on the quality of fishing, and what's the best condition to go head out on a day and do some jigging?
So if you're targeting kingfish, and you want to catch kingfish, and increase your chances of catching kingfish, I find other pelagic fish, it's not so dependent on timing, but kingfish especially, they love the
Yep.
mornings. You want to wake up between, you want to be on the ledge at at dawn, at first light, and you want to be casting out, whether it be shore casting, hard body stick baits,
Yep.
or shore jigging metal lures. You want to be on that ledge first light, and you want to be working that lure up until, you know up until maybe around. I find the bites stop around 11 a.m. When the sun is high. As the sun rises higher, the chance of catching a kingfish dramatically increases, because I find they don't like when the sun is too high and directly on down into the water. They get spooked by the
Yep.
sun. And they tend to move to deeper waters because of that in the middle of the day. But as the sun drops down again, they they might come back, and they might be keen for a bite again. But primarily kingfish, they love the morning, and they love any time when there's a running of current. So I would fish at high tide or incoming high tide. I find it's the best, and then second best is probably
Yep.
outgoing tide, going to low tide. But anytime when there's a lot of current moving through the water, when you see the tide change, that's when kingfish are most active, because it brings in the bait, and then that bait brings in the kingfish. So
Would you say you like the incoming near the top of the tide, or after the turn of the low?
I like incoming near the top of the tide, because there's more water, and so there's more area for
Yep.
fish to travel. You know, but if you're outgoing low, you know, then there's less water for fish to be in, so it's harder for you to catch, more fish, because there's less volume for the fish to actually be in. Why would fish be in a shorter volume where they're all cramped together, and they, you know, but inversely, if there's a lot of bait in the water and it's low tide, um, you might actually get a lot of bait being trapped there, and so the predators might be lurking out in a deeper water, but they might come in every now and then just to
Yep.
swipe at the bait for an easy meal. Um, but the takeaway is as long as there's a movement of water, you'll see kingfish more active than when there is just the water being still, and on the low tide. But if it's on the high tide, sometimes you don't even get any bites on the absolute high tide, the peak of the tide, and the low of the tide. Um, I find that I don't get that many bites, but when there's a tide change and there's a movement of current and water, um, that's when the bites come back, and that's when you see an increase in pelagic action.
Out of those factors that I mentioned, we'll probably talk a few more factors in a moment. But between going head to head with time of day, which is early morning versus the run in high tide and then the start of the run out, which situation would you prefer? So you have situation A with the early morning or the high tide. Situation B, which scenario is better if you can only pick one?
So I would pick the early morning. So I think mornings, like the time of day, is way more important than the tide. Um, just primarily because
Yep.
kingfish, they love that when the light is low, it's like maybe, from horizontal, the sun is horizontal to, 45-degree, and so that's when, like, it's like 11 a.m. at the highest, maybe, and then, from your dawn first light, 6 a.m., you know onwards, they love the light. They're very visual hunters. They're very dependent on seeing their prey before they eat their prey, and so too if there's too much light, it affects their vision. They don't like that. They don't like too much light being in their eyeball, and they're quite sensitive to it. But if it's just enough light where they can see the prey and they can hunt the prey easily, that's when you'll see kingfish come in. That's what they love. And so I would pick, even if it's you know even if it's a very bad tide, as long as it's morning,
Yeah.
I'd pick that over any time. Any other time.
Excellent. What about rainfall? Do you think that has a big effect off the rocks or off the beach?
Actually, quite funny. A lot of times I catch kingfish is like right before a big storm, big heavy rainfall hits. I don't know. I think it's to do with the fact that they love to, No, they love to get as much food in as possible. So just to prepare themselves for the rough conditions, so they don't have to hunt during the rough conditions,
Yep.
and waste their energy. But yeah, I find that kingfish love anytime that's when it's not raining, or just before a big storm hits, or just little light rain. They don't love heavy rain where the water's muddy. And again, they're very visual hunters. When the water's very muddy, it's very hard for them to hunt. So they don't like that at all. They'll rather go back into the deeper waters of the ocean and hunt there instead, where the water clarity is a lot better for them to actually see, and for easy, and it makes it easier for them to hunt, and and have a feed and survive. So I find
Yeah, that sort of
clear water
thing.
better.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, I was just saying I find clear water better, where it's like not
All right.
torrential
Yeah, I
rain.
was just gonna basically add that, with all the amount of guests that I've had talking about kingfish on all the podcasts, definitely one of the main themes is a little bit of rain might be okay, but once you start getting a lot of rain or the salinity drops, which is a main like key here, the salinity as you go further up the river. I mean, in this case, we're talking about shore jigging, shore casting, obviously along the coastal areas. We're talking beaches and off the rocks. But, a lot of these other guests that come on, we talk all the way through the rivers, and, you won't spend your time if you're realistically trying to catch kingfish fishing up near the fresh water, near the weirs, for example.
Yeah,
It's
no.
all down river where you've got clean water, clear water. Maybe a little bit of turbidity is okay, just temporarily, if it's supposed to be a clear area and you've had a tiny bit of rainfall. That might mix up the equation, bring on the bite in certain ways, but definitely a clean water fish, like you said, a visual predator.
Yeah, absolutely. They do not love the dirty water. They love that salinity, the high salinity, the clean, clear water.
Now, you've just said that you think that the start of the storm is a really good time. So, me thinks that that's a barometer point there. The barometer, the quickly falling barometer, because what happens with weather patterns is as a storm's approaching, that's a low pressure trough or low pressure system. And so that can happen very quickly with the impending storm. And I guess that you sort of now believe, or at least you're suggesting that barometer has definitely an impact. And yeah, a lot of people do say that that's an effect that they see as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I don't know too much about barometer and stuff like that and weather patterns or whatever, but I do know that when a storm's about to hit, that's when I get a bite. And it's actually proven that maybe 2 weeks ago when I went fishing, we I was there from dawn, from first light on the ledge all the way until I left, which was like at 11 a.m. And we didn't see any kingfish, any pelagic action. No one caught anything for at least 3 hours. And
Yep.
then right before the storm hit and it started raining was when one person next to me caught a bonito, another person off a ledge nearby caught a bonito as well, and then I caught a kingfish at the very last second. And then after I released
Right.
that, 30 minutes had passed and it started raining. And I was back by that point. I was packing up and leaving. And some of the guys, some of the boys that stayed told me later on when I saw them again, it was that they caught nothing in the rain, no action, no bites,
Yep.
nothing at all. And everyone packed up and then and left. And that just goes to show, like you said, maybe it is something to do with the barometer change. Maybe it is something to do with storms coming that triggers a bite from the kingfish.
Yep. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the gear. Maybe we'll try to make this part brief. We've had a really good discussion so far. The gear, obviously, I could talk forever, and I'm sure you're a gear nut as well. But let's just go through some basic stuff. Someone that wanted to cast a few lures, cast a few jigs. What's the basic essentials that they need?
So I've got like three setups that I use mainly. One's for beach fishing, which is the lighter medium light setup, and one's for I don't want to put up my rude finger, but one's for one's for medium heavy or medium setup we would call it, and that's for
Yeah.
rock fishing, and that's your lighter side of rock fishing. And then you've got your heavy setup, which is your P4, 5, and up. Yeah, and that's for your bigger fish, the 20 kilo plus fish. That I use off the rocks only. I don't use that at the beach at all, or in the harbor. But I do use my medium setup for pretty much the beach, the harbor, and the rocks. So that's
Yep.
my go-to setup, and that's the one that you saw me using earlier. And this is it. So I would suggest
Yep.
for someone who wants to and like a good all rounder setup that to shore jig with, unless you've got the money, to go with three setups like I do. I would say go to the medium setup because that's going to let you catch a variety of species, whether you want to go to the beach and cast off the beach, or you want to go to the rocks or in the harbor. The medium setup is what gonna catch more kingfish than any of the other setups, in my opinion. You know, I do have a heavier setup, but that's me because I want to go for that meter kingy. You're not going to get a ton of bites from smaller kingfish. Uh, that's on the heavy setup. You'll get heaps of bites on the light setup, but you're going to be absolutely dusted if you're fishing on the light setup off the rocks. But medium setup, at least
Yep.
you're going to get enough bites to get you onto a fish, but you're also going to have that power to actually land a fish and not be busted off. So I would go with a
Yep.
medium setup like I have one here.
So like a size 3000 reel and a 10-foot, let's say, I don't know, like a PE1 to PE3 rod.
So for a medium setup, so that setup that I mentioned earlier, you said is for my light setup. So 3000 size reel with a medium light rod. But for medium setup, I would go a medium heavy rod with a either 5,000 size reel or 6,000 size reel. And both reels, all of the reels in a shore jigging setup should all be in the H gear ratio, so the high gear ratio. So that just means
High speed, yep.
every turn of the handle, you're retrieving more line than you would on a P or power gear ratio reel, and that just helps you retrieve more line in quicker and do a variety of different techniques to work the jig or work the stick baits as well. And sometimes if you reel in really fast, it makes the jig or the stick bait move really fast. And sometimes if they're really on the bite, they love chasing something that's fleeing from them really quickly as opposed to something that's slower. You know. But back to
Yep.
the rod and the gear setup, I would use a 5,000 size reel, and the one I have right here is a Certe SW 5,000 XH, so extra
Yep.
high gear, so I can work the lures a bit better. And the line I'm running on it is a P3 size. Actually, I'm running a P2.5, but I would suggest running a P3 line on it.
Yep.
If you're using a 6,000 size reel, P3 for sure. But if you're using a 5,000 size reel, you can either run a P3 line or P2.5 line. And that's connected via a FG knot to a 60-pound leader. So, and that would be my bare
Yep.
minimum for a medium setup is 60 pounds. You got to use 60 pounds because that's going to help you not be able to get busted off on the rocks by a diving kingfish, that's trying to escape. Um, it's going to give you enough abrasion resistance to last that fight, and it's also going to give you enough
Yep.
lifting power so you can grab the leader and pull the fish up if you need to as well. Yeah, and the rod itself, I would say, is a medium heavy setup, and I don't know if you can see. Um,
Does it have a line rating on that rod?
yeah, so the line, so Daiwa's a little bit different on these shore jigging
Or
setup.
PE, if it has a
Yeah,
PE rating?
yeah. So they don't run by kilos on these type of rods. They run by PE rating. So the PE rating on this rod is 1.5 to 3. So 3 is the max, and 1.5 is the minimum.
Yep.
Um, and so that would be the line rating. The jig weight, just reading from the rod, This rod can cast between 20-gram jig and 80-gram jig max. So 20 minimum and 80 max. And a plug is a hard body stick bait. It can cast between 15 grams or 60-gram stick bait at the high
Yep.
end. Yeah. And so the medium setup is
Excellent.
probably my suggestion for anyone that's looking to get into shore jigging. I wouldn't go medium light or anything light setup uh, with for shore jigging off the rocks, because you're gonna get that's gonna end in tears if you don't have enough experience. If you're a brand new beginner, go to medium, medium heavy. And if you're a keen angler and you want to invest more money into your fishing, go with a heavy setup, and good luck to you catching a meter kingy.
Yeah. Let's quickly mention a few lures on the way out of here. So just a few lures that someone could pick up that you reckon that will do the job.
So I would say when you um, start your session, like I said originally, um, get yourself a top water lure. I prefer diving stick baits, so floating stick baits over a popper, because they're just more subtle. They still create a little disturbance in the top of the water, but they're not going to scare fish away.
Yep.
A popper is great when like fish are on the feed, they're on the bite. It mimics fishing feeding on the top of the water, like you said, Shroom. But a
Yep.
diving stick bait just gives it more subtle. It's not going to scare all the fish away. It's going to attract fish more than a popper will. So a diving stick bait that dives underneath the water, and to start your session off, and then um, and then if you're still tired, from jigging in the previous session, I would then move on to something like a sinking stick bait. So something like an Ocean's Legacy, keeling, for example, or something that's
Yep.
a slow sinking. You can use a fast sinking one. I like to use a fast sinking stick bait for my deeper areas. But if you're more of a shallow area, so if it's anything 20 meters or more, fast sinking for sure. If it's 7 to 20 meters, use slow sinking is good as well. It's just going to prevent you from getting snagged really easily. So what would happen? You cast this out, it will land in the water, and it will start to shimmy on the way down like that. And whenever you do a sweep of the rod tip, like I showed earlier, it will then zigzag and swim. And then when it stops swimming is when you're winding in the back the slack line, and then when you pull again, it'll swim again. But when it's on the stop, it's going to be shimmering all the way down and attracting the bite. Giving a chance to catch up, kingfish to catch up, and then decide
Yep.
whether or not it will bite or not. And that's a sinking stick bait. And for other than a sinking stick bait, if you're really lazy and you you love your shore casting, and you don't even want to do the
Yep.
sweep, you don't even want to do the
You just want to
jigging
wind
action,
in.
you just want to wind in, use this baby. So this is a Kavala. This
Yep.
is pretty much shore casting for dummies. You can't go wrong with this, because this will catch fish, no matter what. All you have to do is just cast it out as far as you can, in different directions. Fan your cast, always fan your cast, even if you're doing shore jigging or the other methods.
Yeah.
And you just wind in, and this bad boy will just, because it's got the lip, it will stay underneath the water, and it will dive underneath the water and swim, and it will just attract fish like you wouldn't believe. It's your, you know, fishing fishing for pelagics for dummies. This lure, and I would
Yeah.
use this
Nice.
lure when there's a lot of bust ups. Is good. This lure is good for that. Or sometimes when you're lazy, use this lure, and you're tired, use this lure. It's called a diving minnow, and this one's called
Right.
a Kavala. Um, and so those are your stick baits for your shore casting, and
Yep.
if you want to do shore jigging, um, so I would say, yeah, get your stick baits, get those three types: your floating stick bait, your sinking stick bait, and then your diving minnow. And then so that's in the morning. I like to use hard body lures in the morning, from
Yep.
first light dawn until maybe around 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. And then that's when I'm going to switch to the jigs.
Yep.
And I like to start with a fast moving jig, like let me grab one, like your Gigaro, your palms the
Yep.
Gigaro jig, like this one.
Palms Jigaro.
Yeah, and it's just literally, it's got the double assist hook, and that's it. And you just cast this one out, and you're doing that, that really quick jigging action. That's the lure that I would go with when you think the fish are on the
Perfect.
hot bite. Um, and then on the low end, when the bites, you don't think the bites are very hot right now, I would then switch to your your slow jig, like the palm slow bat, and you're
Yep.
working the jig at a slower pace to attract that bite, and it's going to give you more time in the water column, to not only catch kingfish, but you can also catch a variety of other species, even snapper. I've caught snapper with this jig, off the rocks. And then
Nice.
your last jig that I would use is something like this. So it's a hybrid. So this is the
Right.
Palms Jigaro Super Slide. So it looks like a fast moving responsive jig, but it's made out of, instead of lead, it's made out of zinc, or they call it Z light metal or whatever. So
Yep.
it's a very light metal. So it's still gonna cast pretty far, but it's gonna sink at a much lower pace. And you can see it's also convex right now. One side is convex, and the other side is completely flat. And it's it gives
Yep.
you the best of both worlds. It's gonna jerk back up like a fast moving responsive jig, but it's gonna also flutter really slowly down like a slow jig. These I find are more effective on your pelagics than a slow jig. Uh, and I think
Right.
even a fast moving jig, I love these ones over the other two, because I can work these like a slow jig, and I can work these like a fast moving responsive jig as well. So they're good all rounder. And I think that's about it.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, that sounds great. I think we could wrap up the podcast here. Hi, I've had a great time talking about all these things about shore jigging, shore casting for kingfish, and hopefully the viewers at home, they really enjoyed this one. So, look, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show, and I'd like to ask you, is there anyone that you'd like to thank? And of course, let us know how we can contact you.
Yeah. Yeah, so people can get in touch with me. Just give me a message if you have any questions on Instagram. So that's at hi_life. So HAI_LIFE. Or they can find me on YouTube. I try to do more of an educational type of videos where I teach people how to shore jig. And sometimes I do what Shroom does, and go to the beach and cast out soft plastics, for fun. And I record myself doing that as well. So they can find me on YouTube at High Fishing on YouTube. In terms
Fantastic.
of shouting out anyone, I'd love to thank like ISO Fishing Lifestyle. If you have any questions at all on what tackle to buy, what setup to get, don't just take my word for it. Go to their tackle store and ask them. They know their stuff. They have all the Japanese brands. So if you really are keen to get involved, give their store a visit, and they'll help you out.
All right, fantastic. All right, ladies and gents. So that concludes another Shroom Live podcast. And I'd like you guys, if you enjoyed this one, maybe head on over, send Hi a message, tell him you enjoyed it, on his socials. And of course, if any of you guys want to hop on in a future podcast and you have something to share, a conversation to have with me, have a good time for a couple hours, then shoot me a message. But for now, this is Shroom for the Shroom Live podcast, signing out.